Hi guys, my name is John Edward Willey, and in this first video that I'm making for middle child, I'm hoping to explore and experimentally describe what it is that I think I mean by middle child, and I'm hoping to explain it to you, whoever you are, my listener, what it is that I'm hoping to do in the next videos that I make. But for a while, I'm going to have to sort of let it explain itself because I think that what I do is a process. And I think what middle child is a part of that process. And I think perhaps the best way to explain what it is that I mean by middle child is to examine what is normally meant by the term middle child. Um, it's sort of a cliche. It's sort of a meme that's floating around in the general discussions today. And it sort of usually refers to a person who is sort of left behind or sort of feels lost or sort of feels neglected. I'm not sure if I identify with any of that in terms of my own autobiography. But I do think there's something effectively heuristic or helpful about the term middle child in referring at least specifically to where it is that I'm at in my own life. And I am a middle child, believe it or not. And so much of my own life has had to do with coming back from a position of feeling as if I were sort of lost in life, feeling as if I were sort of left behind or neglected. But I don't necessarily connect that with my childhood or with my older, beautiful sister or my younger brother, who was the charming, hilarious younger one. But in many ways, being a middle child allows me to examine what it means to exist between relations or to live in a sort of intermediary way. Because in many ways, I am a middle child in more than the normal sense of the term. I am entering middle age, or maybe I've already been in middle age longer than I would have wanted to admitted. But I'm sort of living in a place that's between two worlds. My best friends are um, one's in their 80s and the other is in their teens, their early teens, and so I am in many ways stretched between these two worlds. And so it's been said before that one can ride the edges, and it's been said that in certain traditions there are people who, rather than exploring a particular essence per se, and rather than embodying a particular idea, live in relation or a syntopical endeavor, uh, which means by syntopical I mean living in relation between ideas or relation between ideals. Of course, syntopical originally refers to the Gospels, to the Book of John and the Book of Mark and their relation between, but I don't mean that. What I mean is that to think syntopically is a term that was sort of used by a certain school of thinking and pedagogy in the 1950s. But to me, it's come to mean something more than that. It's come to mean that the way that the mind thrives, if it's going to thrive, and the way that thinking sort of comes to find its own fire has to do not necessarily with understanding the ideas in themselves, but understanding that the relation between ideas is where the music of the mind sort of comes to find its own form. And what I mean by that is that a lot of what we are doing in terms of what it means to have a consciousness has to do with examining not necessarily identity or difference in itself, but in examining a web of relations between specifics, and not in terms of ideas, but specifics in terms of our own sensory experience. And so the plenitude, you might say, of being human has to do with examining the richness that's found in the relation between things. And so, again, anytime you think in this way, you always run the risk of repeating what's already been said. And so, the best I can do perhaps is to try to say it in my own way. And so maybe it is in that where some value um, can be found in terms of what I'm trying to do, because in many ways, the next idea that moves through me in being a middle child has to do with the musical nature of the formal quality of thinking, in the sense that there's more going on than the mere ethereal content of logic and content itself. And I think it has to do with the degree to which we bring ideas into life. Not only do we have to live out our ideas in an existential sense, um, but we have to live out our ideas, more broadly speaking. And in many ways, this is a kind of challenge, in the sense that we can live in a particular kind of error, and sort of um, fail to remember that we are not just floating minds. I mean, in fact, I don't necessarily think we're minds at all, but that we are actually beings that have what used to be called an aesthetic relation to the world. And by aesthetic, we don't merely mean art, but aesthetic in the terms of the sensory quality of life, which goes back to what I'm saying about there being a musical dimension, to the mind. And so it's sort of here that I often, in my own thinking, refer to jazz as being the analogy by which I like to think that I'm operating. And so it's no wonder that, some people seem to take on a musical type persona in the way that they philosophize. And this has an impact because there's a sense in which we are more than content, in the sense that we are also voices. And what it means to think is to bring yourself into a concentrated sort of focus, which requires choosing one thing rather than another. And that requires more than a logical um, capacity. It requires a sort of sense of life, a sort of broader sense of what it is that we're doing here. And that's something that I hope to bring into this endeavor. And again, this is simply an exploration of what it means to call myself middle child, or to be in the middle, because you find that not only are we striving to think syntopically, or striving to think in terms of there being a sort of interdisciplinary approach to discovering the very richness in a thinking life, but also to discover the richness in our sensory life, has to do with what used to be called, or what can be called, a holistic vision of life, which means that it doesn't mean anything mystical, but it means that there's always a tension in philosophy between the specifics and the general. And so there is a sense in which we can figure out the practical um, problems of life, or we can at least know what the problems are, and we can at least go about resolving the day to day life, which is so much of the life that we live. But there is a sense in which we wonder, in which there's a question as to how things relate. And more broadly speaking, this might come to mind if there's a catastrophe, and it might come to mind if maybe you've had a few drinks. But there is a sense in which you might begin to really wonder, how does it all fit together, or in other words, what is the meaning of life? And so there is a sense in which one is always already um, a philosopher, insofar as one is always already operating according to an underlying set of presuppositions, or assumptions about what it even means to be alive. I mean, we sort of take for granted that things fit together in a certain way, but to philosophize, um, in other words, to operate in relation between ideas, where you're operating in a critical manner, um, means to question the degree to which you're presuming a certain story, or that you're presuming that things fit together syntopically in a certain way. And so I think so much of what thinking is, and even if it's not an outward questioning of others, it's a questioning of oneself, insofar as one is questioning the most basic relation between ideas that one takes for granted. And so please forgive me for being a little convoluted, for being a little complicated. I'm in of the belief that if you can't speak clearly, I mean, you're not really speaking at all. And so, on the other hand, one has to be complicated. There's no way around it. One has to be a little difficult because what I'm ultimately trying to do is to speak directly, um, to you, my charming, interesting friend, um, whoever you are, um, in such a way that we can build a kind of contact, that we can build a bridge. And so to do so, you have to, be able to, speak in ways that are, on the one hand, potentially redundant, or I mean reductive, potentially like you're speaking in a caricature or a cartoon, or speaking in such a way that's missing the complexity of things. But on the other hand, you might be overstating and overcomplicating, as I tend to. I sort of have a maximalist, urge in my own thinking, which means that I tend to, operate the opposite of what, William of Ockham had put forth as being, um, a way of thinking wherein you reduce down to what can be said, to the most simple. I tend towards the most convoluted, as I said, towards the most opaque, and then ideally I hope to work backwards from there, through a process of subtraction. But again, please forgive me for my own, um, idiosyncratic ways of thinking and organizing my thought. I'm at the very beginning of attempting to explain like what it is that I do, and love to do, and not only that, but to create value for listeners. But I'm still at the very beginning stages, and I'm still, in many ways, surprised, to hear myself speaking. To quote another podcaster who I adore, and so I'm also suffering from this sort of overwhelming paralysis, as if I were speaking truth to power. I mean, to use the Greek word, parrhesia, which in simple terms means frank speech. To the Greeks, parrhesia means the courage to speak directly, to whoever. And in fact, it's a crucial capacity that all of us have to develop in terms of developing our own autonomy. If we are to have an autonomy, you have to be able to, as they used to say, speak up to your mother or father. But in many ways, that means many more things. It means being able ultimately, I think, to speak directly to yourself. And so I think parrhesia, it can be overemphasized that it means speaking to those in power and holding them accountable. But on a more fundamentally honest level, it means the courage to tell yourself the truth. Um, Parisia, I think. And so, in many ways, what I struggle with is the paralysis that comes with telling the truth. Um, it's not as if I don't tell myself the truth, and it's not as if um, I don't speak directly to others. I don't know how to gauge myself to in comparison to others, but I do know that on a certain level, right now, I'm frozen. And I think so long as I can sort of convince myself that what I'm saying is worth saying, and that maybe at least there's some music in what I'm saying, that it's worth doing so. And so I'm sort of attempting to speak, um, in a maximalist way, to sort of outdo myself, and to keep speaking and speaking, as a way of just simply growing more comfortable, with this medium. And so many of these videos, for however long I'm going to be, in many ways fighting with this like core feeling in my stomach, this torturing feeling that I know very well. But what I also know is that the only way you can work through it is by relaxing into it and working through it. And so, if I've learned anything in life, it has to do with the simple ability to, not just speak truthfully to others, to speak openly to others, and to speak, truthfully and openly, to myself, but ultimately, to see that it's a part of a process that you're always trying to expand um, upon, and it in many ways it never ends. So long as you're on that path, you're on that path. And I think what it ultimately opens up, however, if you participate in this process at least half an hour a day or so many hours a day, is that you can create a unique kind of life, insofar as it might fit your natural temperament or mood. And by this kind of life, I mean what can be called the life of the mind, which means that you can, in sort of, carve out a degree of interiority. Um, and I hate to keep using such fancy words without also defining them, but I also think you can probably Google them and get the definition yourself, and you'll probably discover that I might be using the words wrong or in my own personal way. But again, I'm sort of one of those people who has been in hiding for a long time, not out of like despair, but out of necessity, because I've sort of been examining that world within and building a world within. And I sort of um, have been world building since before that was even a term in popular culture, except that I did it within the own what I think of as or what I once thought of as the vastness of my own interiority. And so I'm sort of coming back from that space in the way that I am. And that means discovering things as I go by saying them aloud. And so it's not as if this were the first time I were doing that. Because in many ways, what I'm doing, as I think I might have said or should say, I'm building upon the confidence given to me by a few others who I've actually learned to trust in. And so a lot of what I'm doing is animated by the kind words that they've given me and the positive feedback that I've gotten from them. I think they sort of know who they are, and they should also know that they're sort of forming the core backdrop within which I'm speaking. Because, in many ways, speaking into a microphone in the isolation of my apartment is a lot like being someone on stage who's speaking out into a vast darkness. And that vast darkness is something that, you know, um, I'm gonna have to get used to speaking into. And the only way I can do it is by imagining you, my listener, and then sort of building upon that thread. And there's also a degree to which, to refer again to the musical nature of the mind, that one has to practice a certain degree of extemporaneous speech. One has to practice and improvise a certain capacity to expand upon ideas, because what one must be against is the idea that philosophy is dead. I mean, at least I'm against that. I'm a naturalist, to speak philosophically, and I'm not really. I don't have much patience for metaphysics or superstition. um, but on another level, I do think it's important to sort of examine all of this from that point of view, and to take it all seriously, and to sort of see where it goes, and to sort of see that, um, although I am a naturalist, I do believe that philosophy has a resonance. It has an importance, because on a certain level, if you reach the end of philosophy, which in many ways for me it's the early Heidegger and the later Wittgenstein. For those out there who know philosophy, what that means. Um, I do think there's a sense in which in the Anglo world of analytical philosophy, or what used to be analytical philosophy, there is a sense in which there are no more questions, and I get that, and there's a certain sense within myself within which I get that. And I think that there's a certain liberation to be found in seeing that one can't even begin with questions, that one begins with an affirmation. And in many ways, there's no point really in asking questions about life that are actually sort of epiphenomenal displays of language's capacity to sort of ask questions that it cannot answer. And if you play with language long enough, and you live with philosophy long enough, you find that in many ways it's just a sort of, as, as someone I know says, a form of mental masturbation. And so you find that the great power in life maybe isn't even found in questioning and in philosophy, because on a certain level the power in life is found in something that has very little to do with the mind, and has very little to do with what the mind can do. And there's a lot that can be said about that. And there is a sense in which many people who are hyper intellectual, who cannot stop thinking, have to learn how to stop thinking. In many ways that's a path into it, but what I'm interested in primarily is philosophy. And so Middle Child is an examination of philosophy, except that I'm not necessarily operating in a philosophical manner. I'm operating in a embodied manner, and what I'm attempting to do is to bring philosophy to life. And so I cannot do so by operating according to principles or even a program or a schematic outline. I can only operate according to the kind of order that my spontaneous speech allows me. I mean, I hate to be see, I was gonna say I hate to be hyperbolic, but even saying that reveals how how stupid I can sound. And I believe in myself, and I know that the language I use in many ways is an attempt to actually create shortcuts, because it does. Because once you get used to a certain language, it actually offers you a more conducive way of thinking about things. At least I find. And so there's a sense in which a lot of the language I use um, has a vital role. But on the other hand, I'm very aware of the fact that, living in the Midwest as I do, and growing up in such a way where I was unaware of it and I was struck by it, because I'm naturally, I hate to say it, but I'm sort of an intellectual, a closeted intellectual. I sort of, I do my work within myself, and I'm not really, I don't really have take much pleasure or find much meaning in necessarily arguing with other people or speaking in such a way. I find much more joy and much more practical um, uh, help or power is sort of found in engaging people on a more human level. I hate to say it, but I've given the jobs that I've had in my background, I've sort of learned the hard way what it means to have your head up your ass, and what it means to really live in your mind. And I've lived through all of that, and luckily I've met the kind of people who had the parrhesia or courage to speak truthfully to me. But on the other hand, you have to come back from saying or realizing how little you know, because there's a certain sense in which negation and the deconstructive capacity of real thinking can render a person with into a kind of like negation themselves, where they can become cynical or bitter, or they think they know more than others by knowing they know nothing. um, but I think the more potentially negative effects have to do with the inability to believe in oneself at all, because on a certain level, something I've learned um, in relation to some of the people that I've respected, this reveals the degree to which we're always operating with a certain bias, because there's certain people we tend to identify with, and then we 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 learn things from them that are not necessarily principles or prescriptive truths, um, but they're sort of like things that are very, very helpful and cannot be overlooked. And so, one thing I learned was that you have to be relatively arrogant in order to think at all. And what that means is that there's a certain degree of courage required to think, where you have to sort of like, at least for a second, have the arrogance, quote unquote, to pretend that you know something that you don't necessarily know. And to go back to what I was saying about growing up in the Midwest, I have a keen sense of the what can be called the anti-intellectualism of America, which is sort of well known in different parts of the world or in different people. But it ultimately has to do with the fact, in many ways, that because we've developed a certain form of life, which I don't think should be seen morally. It's not a moral question, but it should be seen in regards to what it has done to at least the culture that I've lived through in the Midwest, which is that for all intents and purposes, it's an anti-aesthetic culture. It's an anti-intellectual culture. In many ways, the values are shaped by loosely speaking, what is a Roman heritage, and that's a Roman heritage, and by which I mean it's a heritage that's rooted in the works of Cicero and Seneca, who largely look down upon art and lyric poetry as being sort of secondary to the practical and the pragmatic, and in many ways, perhaps the genius in American culture is the degree to which it's mastered that, and in many ways that cannot be overlooked. So I don't speak in a way where I'm speaking down about that, but I am speaking in a way where I'm keenly aware of the degree to which, if you have an aesthetic, artistic sensibility, it's better to get out of this part of the country. But of course, that could be seen as being false in itself because, in many ways, the anti-intellectual is is in people's minds, and those minds are not as localized as we might like to think they are. And in many ways, the Midwest is not the cliche that people think it is. Otherwise, how would I exist here? Because in many ways, I long identified with what could be called the Bohemian, or a sort of radical resistance to these pragmatic, practical norms. But over time, I myself, like many others, I've become softened by the push and pressure of time and what life does to you. And so entering or already being in middle age, I'm not quite sure. I am certainly in the middle of something, and I'm being in the Midwest. I find that that has a particular resonance, um, as well when it comes to playing upon, experimenting upon, thinking as a way of singing upon this motif, the motif being the middle, because that's what I mean by middle child. I'm in many ways living in the Midwest. In fact, I'm at the very beating heart of a continent that, in many ways, is barely beating, and in many ways, it's a sort of middle passage in itself because, politically speaking, um, I'm not going to say much, but what I can say is that in many ways I'm in the middle of many things, and so I think we all know W.B. Yeats's line about the people who are soft spoken. I'm not going to recite it because of how redundant that would be, given those who know it. But there's a particular bittersweetness that comes with being in the middle, and to pay tribute to a little bit of my own lineage. There are many figures and many times who are very many ways, the first ones to go, given the position to which they're trying to straddle. And so, again, that's a motif, and that's a play upon um, being a middle child. And I say child because, in many ways, there's a certain degree of what I think I've called radical humility, and that's a phrase that I use again in my own thinking because I can't help it, because it refers to what it means to question your own paradigms or your own mythology or your own story, and not as a way of simply replacing it with something else, but as a way of finding that when you can, in many ways, let go of that, or more properly speaking, when it lets go of itself, when it no longer makes sense to you, you'll find that you don't have, there's no magical moment at which you let go of it, that it gradually makes less sense to you, and so it gradually disappears from your cognizance whatsoever. I think that in many ways, being a child is being reborn in lieu of that. And so, in many ways, I'm not going to say too much about anything, but there is a particular kind of like um, optimism in me. And I think that if you come out of the Western philosophical tradition, as I do, in the sense that I'm self aware of my relation to that tradition, you find that there are certain things you can't let go of. And I think what can be seen as is a particular kind of humanism in me, which is, by humanism I mean a belief in human beings, if not in our own rationality, then our own capacity to overcome obstacles. Um, I think that that optimism is par and course with the philosophical tradition, and so um, at least it is in me. And it could be temperamental, it could be um, because of who I am, but I ultimately believe in rebirth. And so I have a, speaking of humanism, I have a particular relation to um, the Italian um, renaissance. And so when I say that I'm a child, I mean that in many ways I am playing in the ruins of of past cultures, and I'm playing in the ruins of the wreckage of our past history. And in many ways, I'm digging through that wreckage. In many ways, I'm seeking to do again and again, I think, as much as I can, um, what it is that I most revere, which is the people who can let go of what isn't working or what doesn't make sense or what isn't feeding or isn't um, logically making sense or isn't fitting what we take to be a more natural sense of the world. We find that what we're seeking isn't to simply tell ourselves a story, but to pay attention in such a way that we ourselves can give birth to a more coherent sense of at least what it is that it means to be alive. And so to many that's perhaps passe, but to a person, a child, it is a question that is perpetually open. And in many ways, the questions are the answer. And so, in many ways, the questions are fundamental to what I'm trying to do here with Middle Child. And I just happen to notice that I've been speaking for 31 minutes and 18 seconds. And so, why not um, just go a little bit further, perhaps, because I don't want to weigh too much upon the ears of those who are patient enough to listen to me speak for this long. I suppose the thing that I'm learning at this stage is the degree to which I have to tie up what I say. I'm learning to listen to what I say in the way that I had to write for a long time in the way that I'm learning how to speak now. And my writing is just now taking off, quote unquote. I'm enjoying it more than I ever have. In other words, because of the degree to which I, for a long time, wrote and wrote without any desire to show anyone, and in fact, without any desire to even to read my own writing. And so, what I mean by developing the kind of self-esteem where you have the arrogance to be a person, to have a vision, to think, to experiment, to test, I'm sort of putting my writing out there, and I'm also attempting to put this out there because it's fundamental in what I'm doing. And so, in many ways, I'm sort of going to go back and probably listen to myself, and then in the next videos build upon that. But for right now, I'm having to really learn how to just stop talking and to sort of shut myself up. This is Middle Child signing off.